Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Think of a place where the mountains keep secrets that time won't let out, and every trail can lead to safety or total loss. The Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina are what we're talking about. Many people thought they were still wild and impossible to get to in 1913. This video is not real. It was made just for fun. There is no connection between this and real people, living or dead. That year, North Carolina was going through a strange time in its history. Coastal cities were starting to accept modernity, but mountain towns were still cut off from the rest of the world, with only dirt roads connecting them. These roads turned into rivers of mud during the heavy autumn rains. It was a different world where news took days to get there, and the law didn't reach very far. The Appalachians in that area made a natural maze of deep valleys, thick forests, and peaks that reached the clouds. Families lived on farms that were far apart from each other. They grew corn and tobacco, raised pigs and chickens, and lived lives that had not changed much in the last 100 years. Life there was hard but predictable, until something started to mess up this old routine. People in Mitchell County knew Abram Hargrove as a man with simple, predictable habits. He owned a small piece of land near Spruce Pine and spent his days working it and going to town to sell his crops and buy supplies. His cabin was in a clearing surrounded by old oak trees. It was so quiet that the wind blowing through the trees sounded like a quiet conversation. People who lived nearby said he was quiet but friendly, always paid his bills on time, and didn't get into trouble very often. There was nothing about him that made people think his name would become linked to one of the darkest mysteries of those mountains. But in September 1913, everything changed in a way that no one could have predicted. Samuel Dawson, a traveler, was the first to notice that something was wrong. In September, he walked through the Hargrove property one afternoon, following the trail that went through the mountains to Tennessee. Dawson was a traveling merchant, one of those guys who knew every twist and turn in the Appalachian roads, every stream where he could get fresh water, and every cabin where he could get a hot meal. He stopped at the Hargrove property, expecting to be welcomed, as was usual in the area, but instead he found a disturbing silence. The door to the cabin was open and swaying in the afternoon breeze. The pigs were pacing back and forth near the barn, and the chickens were running all over the place. Dawson called Hargrove many times but got no answer. He felt uneasy for no reason and thought he shouldn't be there because of something in the air. He chose not to go into the cabin and kept going. But 2 days later, when he got to Spruce Pine, he talked about the event in a local bar. People were somewhat interested. People often left the property for a few days to visit family or do business in nearby counties. But when more stories came out, the case got worse. A woman who lived a few kilometers away said she saw smoke coming from Hargrove's chimney in the early morning hours, which was strange. Hargrove usually put out the fire well before midnight, so she thought it was strange. Another neighbor said that he heard noises coming from that direction. He couldn't say what they were, but they made him so uneasy that he locked all the doors in his house. These stories were vague and broken, but when put together, they made a disturbing picture. Veteran Mitchell County Sheriff Theodore Marsh chose to look into it himself. Marsh was a practical man who was used to dealing with fights over land, fights in taverns, and the odd case of cattle rustling. He had never seen anything like what he found on that remote property before. When he got there with 2 deputies, the place was even worse than Dawson had said it would be. The door to the cabin was still open, but now there was a bad smell in the air that mixed with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. It looked like everything inside the cabin had been left behind in a hurry. There were still plates on the table with food on them that flies had already gotten to. There were clothes all over the floor and drawers open, as if someone had been looking for something right away. The dark stains on the wooden floor were the most disturbing thing. They made strange shapes that made it look like something terrible had happened there. Marsh told the deputies to look around the barn and the area around it, while he carefully looked at each room in the cabin. The discovery in the barn was even more disturbing. Things that usually hung on the walls were all over the floor, some with strange markings. There were signs that something heavy had been dragged across the ground, leaving a trail that led to the back of the property. The forest swallowed up any evidence in complete darkness. The deputies followed this path for a few dozen meters, but the thick plants and uneven ground made it impossible to go on without more men and the right tools. Marsh looked sad when he got back to Spruce Pine that night. He called a meeting with some important people in the community and local government officials. The talk was tense. Everyone wanted to know where Abram Hargrove was and what had really happened on that land. Marsh was careful with what he said, but he made it clear that this was serious and needed a full investigation. He put together a search team to go back to the site the next morning, this time with more people and resources. The next morning, 12 men, including Sheriff Marsh, his deputies, and some volunteers who knew the area well, set out from Spruce Pine to look for the missing person. The day started out cloudy, and a thick fog came down from the mountains and swirled around the trees like a ghostly veil. The locals knew this kind of weather well. It turned familiar trails into confusing mazes and made sounds travel in strange ways through the valleys. They started a methodical search as soon as they got to the property. They broke up into smaller groups, each in charge of a certain area. Some people searched the cabin again, this time more carefully, writing down everything that was out of place and every detail. Others followed the trail that had been found the day before, bringing tools to clear away plants and flashlights to light up the darkest parts of the forest. A third group looked at the property lines to see if there were any signs that someone might have escaped or been taken from there. What they found in the next few hours only made the mystery deeper. They found a diary that had been partially burned inside the stove in the cabin. The pages that were still there had notes about daily farm work, market prices, and short notes about the weather. Nothing that seemed important, until one of the deputies saw something strange in the last few entries. The way the letters looked changed. It got uneven and rushed, like it was written when the writer was very upset. The words were broken up and hard to read, but some phrases stood out in a disturbing way. Mentions of unknown visitors, hints at business deals that Hargrove wanted to keep secret, and a last line that said, "I can't trust anyone anymore." In the meantime, the group following the trail through the woods found something that made their blood run cold. They found clear signs of disturbance in the soil about a mile from the main cabin, in a deep ravine with very thick vegetation. The ground had been disturbed not too long ago, and leaves and branches had been placed in a very clear way over a certain area. They carefully took these things out and saw that something had been buried there, but they didn't find a body. Instead, they found Hargrove's personal items, like his pocket watch, some coins, and property papers that had been carefully wrapped in oiled leather to keep them dry. It was like someone had buried Hargrove's things but not Hargrove himself. Or maybe, as some of the men started to talk quietly to each other, it was as if Hargrove had hidden these things and was getting ready to leave. But why did he go? And where could he have gone? There were more questions than answers. The search went on for 3 more days. Groups of volunteers searched miles of forest, followed every trail, and looked in every known cave in the area. They sent messages to nearby counties asking if anyone had seen a man who looked like Hargrove. They went to see relatives, friends, and business associates who lived far away. No one had seen or heard from him since that week in September. It was like he had just disappeared into the mountains he knew so well. The different stories that started to come out made everything even stranger. A merchant in Spruce Pine swore she had sold supplies to Hargrove just 2 days before his disappearance was reported, and he seemed perfectly normal, even cheerful. A farmer who lived in the opposite direction claimed to have seen someone who might be Hargrove walking along the main road one night, carrying a heavy suitcase, moving with unusual haste. Another testimony, this one from a lumberjack who worked in the higher mountains, mentioned seeing smoke coming from an abandoned cabin years ago, situated in a location so remote that few ventured there. Marsh tried to organize all this information, but the more he investigated, the more confusing the case became. It was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces didn't fit, and the other half seemed to belong to completely different pictures. In October 1913, when the first snows began to cover the highest peaks of the Appalachian, the official search was suspended. There was no body, no clear suspects, no explanation that made sense. Abram Hargrove had simply disappeared, leaving behind only questions and a property that no one now wanted to buy or even visit. With the arrival of winter, life in Spruce Pine gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but the case of Abram Hargrove continued to be a topic of conversation in taverns, churches, and community gatherings. People created their own theories, each more elaborate than the last. Some believed that Hargrove had incurred debts with dangerous people and fled to avoid consequences. Others suggested that he might have discovered something valuable in the mountains, perhaps gold or precious stones, and decided to disappear with his fortune to start a new life in another state. There were even those who speculated that supernatural forces were involved, as those mountains had always had a reputation for harboring unexplained phenomena. Sheriff Marsh, however, was not satisfied with speculation. Throughout the winter months, he continued his discreet investigation, revisiting witnesses, examining old records in the county registry, trying to find some connection that everyone else had missed. It was during this persistent investigation that he discovered something intriguing. Hargrove had made several trips to Asheville in the months leading up to his disappearance, something unusual for a rancher who rarely left his region. The trips were always short, never lasting more than 2 or 3 days, but they were frequent enough to attract attention. In February 1914, when the roads finally became passable again after the thaw, Marsh decided to go to Asheville in person. The city was much bigger than Spruce Pine, which was a major business center for the whole area of North Carolina. He spent days talking to people who might have known Hargrove, like shopkeepers, hotel workers, and telegraph operators. Most people didn't remember him, but a clerk at a law office knew the name right away. Hargrove had talked to a lawyer about property issues. It seems that he wanted to sell his farm, but he didn't want his neighbors or the community to know about it. Edmund Whitfield, an older lawyer, said that Hargrove seemed nervous during their meetings. He kept looking over his shoulder and talking in a low voice even when they were alone in the office. Whitfield thought the behavior was strange, but not strange enough to turn down the service. Hargrove had said that he wanted to move west, maybe to Oregon or Washington, where the land was rich and there were lots of chances. This information changed how people thought about the case completely. Maybe Hargrove wasn't the victim of anything bad. Maybe he had just followed a carefully thought-out plan to disappear and start over. But why did he leave his property papers buried in the woods? Why leave his farm without finishing the sale? And what could explain the scary stains on the cabin and the obvious signs of a fight or disturbance? Marsh went back to Spruce Pine with more questions than answers. He called a meeting with his deputies and a few trusted citizens to talk about what was going on. The talk was very heated. Some people said that they should start the full search again as soon as spring came. Some people thought they were chasing ghosts because it was clear that Hargrove had run away and didn't want to be found. One of the deputies brought up an idea that no one had thought about seriously before. What if more than one person was involved? What if Hargrove had business partners who didn't like his plans to leave with the money? Something unexpected happened while these talks were going on. A pastor who was traveling through the mountains and preaching in small, remote towns came to Spruce Pine with a scary story. He had stopped at a cabin in the middle of nowhere to get out of the snowstorm and was met by a man who lived there alone. The man told the others around the fire at night that he had found strange things in the woods months before. These included things that looked like they had been quickly hidden, clothes that were stained, a knife with an ornate handle, and some tools whose purpose he couldn't figure out. The pastor hadn't thought much about it at the time, but when he got to Spruce Pine and heard about Hargrove's case, things started to make sense to him. Marsh quickly put together a trip to that faraway cabin. It took almost 2 days of riding along steep and dangerous trails to get there. At first, the man who lived there didn't want to help, but after a while, he agreed to show them where he had found the things. He took them to a secret stream deep in the woods where not many people went. There were the things he had talked about, partly hidden by leaves and branches. The knife really caught Marsh's eye because it had the initials AH carved into the handle. The discovery of the knife with Hargrove's initials on it brought the investigation back to life with a level of intensity that hadn't been seen since the case first started. Marsh told everyone to carefully write down and bring back to Spruce Pine everything they found near the creek. Even though the clothes had been worn by time and the weather, they could still be looked at. People said the tools were the kind that are often used on farms in the area, but the way they had been thrown away was strange. It was as if someone had tried to get rid of them quickly, but didn't want to go too far from the area. A lot of questions were asked of the man who lived in that remote cabin, a hermit named Josiah Creek. He said that he had only found the things by accident while hunting, and that he didn't know anything about Hargrove or his disappearance. Witnesses said that Creek had lived in those mountains for years, long before Hargrove moved there, so his story seemed true. Marsh finally decided that Creek was just an innocent bystander who happened to find proof of something much bigger. But the question was still there. How did Hargrove's things end up miles away from his house, in the opposite direction from where his papers were buried? It was like a lot of people were involved, and each one was taking a different part of his life in a different direction. Or maybe Hargrove made a false trail on purpose by spreading his things around to throw off any future investigations. In April 1914, something unexpected happened that changed the case. A store owner in Marion, which is a long way from Spruce Pine, went to the police with some interesting information. He said that a man had bought things from his store a few months ago and paid with old gold coins. The man was very nervous. The merchant didn't think much of it at the time, but when he sorted through his records for the year, he found a note the man had dropped with a list of things and the name Hargrove written in the corner. Marsh went to Marion right away to look into it himself. The merchant gave a full description of the man. He was of average height, had a dark beard, and his eyes always looked away from direct contact. His hands were calloused from working the land. The description was pretty close to what Hargrove looked like, but not exactly. There were small differences that made Marsh think twice. Could it really be Hargrove trying to stay out of sight? Or was it someone else who used his name? Maybe someone took on his identity after something bad happened. The sheriff followed this lead for weeks, going to nearby towns and showing Hargrove's description to dozens of people. Some people thought they had seen someone like that, while others were sure they hadn't. The testimonies were so different from each other that Marsh started to wonder if he was chasing a ghost, a mirage made by the group's desire to solve a mystery that may not have had a solution. At the same time, Hargrove's property in Spruce Pine was still empty. No one wanted to buy it, even when the county tried to sell it at an auction to pay off back taxes. The place's reputation had gotten too bad. People said they heard strange noises coming from that direction at night and saw lights in the windows of the empty cabin that they couldn't explain. These stories were probably just made up, the result of months of speculation and imagination, but they still kept people away. In May 1914, the Mitchell County News, a local newspaper, published a series of articles about the case that tried to sum up everything that was known up to that point. Harold Pembroke, the journalist in charge, had done his own research and talked to witnesses that the police had missed. He found out that Hargrove had been getting mail from someone in Kentucky on a regular basis in the months before he went missing. The postal worker vaguely remembered the letters because they always came on the same day of the week and had a strange stamp. Pembroke tried to find out who sent the letters, but the return address was for a boarding house that had closed a year earlier. This was another dead end. He went ahead and published his findings, hoping that someone who read the newspaper could help him find the missing piece of the puzzle. The answer was unexpected. 3 people wrote to the newspaper saying they knew Hargrove from very different situations. He said he had worked for a short time at a sawmill in Tennessee years ago. Another person said they saw him at a church meeting in Asheville. The third, most interesting, said that Hargrove had a twin brother that no one in Spruce Pine knew about. They had been separated after a family fight decades earlier. The news about a possible twin brother changed the course of the investigation completely. At first, Marsh was unsure, but he decided to follow up on this lead with the same care that he had shown in all of his work on the case. Martha Caldwell, an old woman who lived in a small town near Boone, wrote to the newspaper. She said she knew the Hargrove family when she was young, before they moved to the Spruce Pine area. Martha said that the twin brothers were very close when they were young, but a fight over family money had split them up for good. Martha welcomed Marsh into her small home, which was surrounded by beautiful gardens and a view of the mountains, when he came to interview her in person. She had a good memory for someone her age, and she remembered specific things about the Hargrove brothers that backed up her story. She said that Abram was the quieter of the two. He always liked to work alone in the fields. His brother, whose name she remembered as Abraham, with a slight change in pronunciation, was more outgoing and interested in business and speculation. Martha said that their mother sometimes got them mixed up when they were young because they looked so much alike. The family farm was the source of the disagreement that split them up. The father died without leaving a clear will, and the 2 siblings disagreed on how to split up the property. The situation got worse until one of the brothers, Martha couldn't remember which one, just took his share of the movable property and left, promising never to talk to the other again. This would have happened in 1895, almost 20 years before he went missing. After that, Martha lost touch with her family, but she did hear news from time to time through mutual friends. Marsh thought he had finally found something important. If Abram had a twin brother, this could explain the different reports, the small differences in the descriptions, and the constant feeling that there were 2 versions of the same story happening at the same time. But new questions came up. Where was this brother now? Could he have something to do with the disappearance? Or could it be that the sightings after the disappearance were of the brother and not Abram? Marsh started looking for records in Spruce Pine that could prove that this second Hargrove really existed. The county archives were messy and missing a lot of information, especially for older records, but he did find a land purchase document from 1895 that listed 2 buyers with the last name Hargrove. Only one of them stayed in the area, but the other one had sold his share of the property months after the first purchase and then disappeared from local records. This discovery opened up a whole new set of options. Marsh sent telegrams to officials in nearby counties asking if they had any records of someone named Hargrove who looked like Abram. It was especially interesting to hear back from a sheriff in Tennessee. In 1910, a man named Abraham Hargrove, whose name was spelled a little differently, was briefly arrested for being involved in a business dispute. He had been let go when the charges were found to be false, but his police record matched Abram's exactly, down to the scar on his right hand that several people in Spruce Pine had seen. In June 1914, Marsh chose to go on a longer trip, following the trail of this possible brother through Tennessee. He knew it was a dangerous trip that would take him far from his duties as sheriff, but he thought he was finally getting closer to solving the mystery. He took a train to Knoxville and then rode a horse through a number of smaller towns, showing a drawing of Hargrove and asking the same questions over and over. Most people didn't know who the man was, but some people remembered someone who looked a lot like him who had been in the area years before. Marsh finally got a solid lead in a small town called Greenville. A blacksmith in the area not only knew the sketch, but also had specific information about it. The man had worked for him for a short time in the summer of 1913, just before Abram went missing. He said his name was Abraham and that he was on his way through to save money for his trip west. The blacksmith said he was a good worker but quiet. He had something heavy on his mind, but didn't tell anyone about it. What was most interesting was that the man left town without warning in September 1913, taking his pay with him. The blacksmith thought it was strange at the time because he had offered the man a permanent job, and the man seemed interested. The date of departure was almost the same as the date that Abram was last seen in Spruce Pine. It was too much of a coincidence to not pay attention to. Marsh stayed in Greenville for another week, looking for other people who had met this Abraham. A boarding house owner vaguely remembered him and said that he didn't eat with the other guests very often because he liked to stay in his room. She had seen that he sometimes got mail, and the letters seemed to make him angry. Sadly, she didn't have any envelopes or records that could show where these letters came from. Marsh was sure that the twin brothers were at the center of the mystery when he finally got back to Spruce Pine in July 1914. But what did each of them do? Could it be that they planned to switch identities? One of them wanted to disappear, and the other agreed to help by taking over their life for a while the first person ran away to a faraway place? Or was there something more sinister going on, like an old feud that had finally gotten out of hand and had bad effects that couldn't be undone? The sheriff held a meeting in front of the public to talk about what he had found. That warm summer night, the little church in Spruce Pine was full. People from nearby towns came to hear the latest news about the case that had everyone in the area talking. Marsh carefully went over everything he had found, from the first signs of the brothers' existence to the sightings in Tennessee. The audience listened in awe, with only a few whispers of surprise breaking the silence. Marsh made an appeal at the end of the presentation. Anyone who knew anything about Abram Hargrove, the brothers' conversations, or any strange trips or meetings in the months before he went missing should come forward. The answer was better than he had hoped for. A lot of people gave bits of information that didn't seem important on their own, but when put together, they started to make sense. Someone remembered that in the early summer of 1913, Abram had an unexpected visitor. A man who rode up on horseback and stayed on the property for a few days. Another person said they saw two very similar men talking intensely on a remote trail, as if they were talking about something important. A merchant said that in August, Abram bought twice as much food as he usually did, as if he were getting ready to feed more than one person. The testimonies gathered at the public meeting changed the case from a simple mystery to something much more interesting and complicated. Marsh spent the next few weeks putting all of this information together and trying to make sense of the events that led up to the disappearance. This careful analysis showed that two brothers, who had been apart for years and were angry with each other, had started to talk to each other again in the months before September 1913. It wasn't clear what kind of contact they were having, but it was clear that they were planning or negotiating something important. Willis Brennan, a retired mailman who had worked in the area for decades before passing the job on to his son, gave one of the most revealing testimonies. Willis had a great memory for faces and mail, which was very useful when letters were the main way to talk to people who lived far away. He could clearly remember bringing Abram Hargrove several letters from different towns in Tennessee during the summer of 1913. The fact that these letters came in plain envelopes with no return address, and that Abram always seemed excited to get them, waiting on the porch for the mailman to come, made them stand out. Willis also remembered a strange thing that happened in August of that year. He had come to Hargrove's house to drop off a package and saw two men on the porch. At first he thought he was seeing double because they looked so much alike. They were sitting quietly, each smoking a pipe and looking at the mountains far away. One of them quickly stood up and went into the cabin when Willis got close, as if he didn't want to be seen. Willis thought the other person was Abram. They took the package with a quick nod and closed the door without saying thank you. The postman thought the behavior was strange, but he didn't think much of it at the time because he thought it was because Hargrove was shy. This description confirmed that the brothers had met, but it also made me wonder even more. Why did Abraham want to stay out of sight? What were they planning that needed to be kept secret? And why, just a few weeks after this meeting, would Abram completely disappear, leaving behind a scene that made it look like something bad had happened? Marsh chose to look into Hargrove's finances, which had been ignored until then. He got permission to look at the few bank records that were available in the area. What he found out was surprising. In the months before he went missing, Abram took out a lot of money from his account. Each withdrawal was small enough that it didn't raise any suspicions on its own, but together they made up almost all of his savings. The last withdrawal happened in mid-August, which was the same time that his brother was seen on the property. But there was something even more interesting. In July 1913, a large sum of money was deposited into Abram's account. This amount was much more than he could have made by selling goods from his farm. The records didn't say where the money came from, but the bank manager vaguely remembered Abram saying that he had sold something valuable, maybe a family heirloom that he had finally been able to sell. The manager didn't ask any more questions at the time, but looking back, that deal seemed fishy. Marsh came up with a new theory after making this discovery. What if the brothers were working together on a project? Maybe they had something valuable from their parents that needed to be sold or split up, and they were finally settling the old argument that had kept them apart. But what had gone wrong? Why would Abram go missing right after it looked like he had solved his money problems? In August 1914, exactly a year after the brothers probably last saw each other, Marsh got an unexpected letter. A lawyer in Louisville, Kentucky, wrote to him to tell him that a man named Abram Hargrove had died there in July from a sudden fever. The lawyer was looking for family members to let them know about the death and help with problems that came up with the man's few belongings. There was a sealed envelope among these things that said it should only be opened by legal authorities if he died. Marsh went right away to Louisville, which was a long and tiring trip that took several days. Pearl Thornton, the lawyer he finally met, was a stern man who greeted him with careful formality. Thornton said that Abram Hargrove had come to Louisville a few months before and was clearly sick but wouldn't get the right medical care. He rented a small room in a boarding house and lived in complete isolation until he died. The landlady only found out he had died when the rent was late, and she went into the room to look around. Marsh and the lawyer were there when the sealed envelope was opened. There was a letter inside with shaky handwriting, which was clearly written by someone who was sick. The information was both eye-opening and very upsetting. Abraham admitted that he and his brother Abram had planned to switch places. Abraham had the idea when he was in a bad place, with debts he couldn't pay, and people after him who wanted to see him hurt by failed businesses. Even though they had been apart for years, Abram agreed to help because he still felt a sense of family loyalty. The idea behind the plan was simple. but carrying it out was hard. Abraham would pretend to be Abram and live in Spruce Pine, while Abram would take their savings and move to the west to start over in a place where no one knew them. They had practiced the conversation for weeks, during which time Abraham learned a lot about Abram's life, habits, neighbors, and the farm's daily routine. Everything seemed to be going well until something went wrong. At this point, the letter got confusing, as if Abraham was having trouble explaining things that still bothered him. He talked about a fight the night before Abram left that was about money that hadn't been divided up according to the original agreement. He wrote about people blaming each other, old grudges coming back stronger than expected, and the stress getting so high that it was about to break. The letter then suddenly said that Abram had left that night, taking more than they had agreed on. Abraham was left alone on a property that wasn't really his, living a life that wasn't really his. Abraham said that he had tried to keep up the act for a few days, but he quickly realized that it was not possible. He didn't know enough about Abram's life to answer the neighbors' questions, and he didn't know how to run the farm properly. He was in a panic. He planned to make something bad happen so that he could disappear. He moved his and Abram's things around to make a confusing scene that would make any investigation impossible. Then he ran away, first to Tennessee and then to Kentucky, always using the name Abraham. He never got away from the guilt and the failure of his bad plan. The letter ended with an apology to the people of Spruce Pine and the police. Abraham said he didn't know where his brother was, but he thought Abram had probably made it west as planned and was now living under a different name, free from the problems of his old life. He said he was sorry for all the trouble it caused, but he insisted that no real crime had been committed, except for the identity theft that had never been fully carried out. Marsh read the letter over and over again, trying to understand all of its meanings. Some of the mystery was finally solved, but there were still a lot of questions that needed to be answered. Did Abram really just leave for the West? Or was there something more evil in that last talk that Abraham couldn't or wouldn't fully explain? Could all of this, like the disturbing stains in the cabin, the signs of a fight or disturbance, and the personal items buried in different places, have been just Abraham's acting to make it look like something else? Or was there something bad about that night that the letter left out on purpose? When Marsh got back to Spruce Pine, he had to figure out how to share his findings with the community. Abraham's letter gave answers, but they were answers that made things even more unclear. In September 1914, the sheriff called another public meeting, this time hoping that he could finally bring the case that had been bothering the area for more than a year to a close. People were once again crammed into the church, eager for news and hoping that the mystery would finally be solved once and for all. Marsh read parts of the letter out loud, leaving out parts that he thought were too personal or could hurt the brother's memory. The audience's response was mixed. Some people were relieved to hear that no violent crime had been committed and that the story was just about two brothers making bad and desperate choices. Some people still weren't sure, though, and wondered if the letter really told the whole truth. Abraham's description of that last night seemed incomplete, as if he were leaving out important details on purpose. A well-known and respected farmer named Elias Drummond stood up and said what many people were thinking. How could they be sure Abraham was telling the truth in his letter? A man on the verge of death, consumed by fever and guilt, could be leaving out important details or even lying to protect his own conscience. What if something much worse had happened between the brothers that night? What if Abram had never left the property alive? Marsh agreed that these were real worries. He said that he had done more to look into the claims made in the letter. He had sent telegrams to officials in a number of western cities, mostly in Oregon and Washington, the states that Abram was supposed to be going to, asking if anyone who fit his description had recently moved there. He also asked them to look into land purchase records, business licenses, and any other official documents that might have the name Hargrove or something similar in them. In the weeks that followed, the answers started to come in, but they were frustrating because they were not always the same. Several people said they had seen or known someone who might fit Abram's description, but none of these leads led to definite confirmations. A sheriff in Portland, Oregon, talked about a farmer who came to the area in the fall of 1913 and bought a small piece of land near the Columbia River. The man kept to himself and used the name Adam Harmon, close enough to Abram Hargrove to be suspicious, but the physical descriptions didn't perfectly match. He was taller than Abram, according to witnesses, and had a scar on his face that no one in Spruce Pine had ever mentioned. Another clue came from Spokane, Washington, where a trader reported dealing with a man who introduced himself as Abraham Hart and seemed to have detailed knowledge of Appalachian agriculture. This man had appeared in town in October 1913, was approximately Abram's age, and vaguely matched the physical description. But again, there were minor inconsistencies that made it impossible to confirm with certainty. Marsh was beginning to realize that he might never be able to definitively prove Abram's fate. The American West was too big, with places still being settled, and communities that were so far away that a man could easily disappear and start over without leaving any reliable evidence. Hargrove's property, on the other hand, stayed empty and got worse and worse. The cabin started to fall apart because it had been neglected for so long. The roof had holes in it, and the wind and the curiosity of occasional visitors broke the windows. In early 1915, the county finally sold it at auction. However, the buyer was a land speculator from outside the area who never planned to live there. He just wanted the land because it could be used for mining and timber. While clearing the land to get it ready to sell, workers hired by the new owner found something disturbing under the cabin floorboards. They found a hollow space in an area that had been covered by a thick carpet. It looked like it had been made on purpose. There was a rusty metal box inside this hiding place that had papers, old photos, and a few gold coins in it. The papers included the twin brothers' birth certificates, which proved that they were real, and that they were born on the same day in 1870. The brothers also wrote letters to each other over the years. These letters showed that their relationship was much more complicated than anyone had thought. The first letters, which were written in 1896, not long after the brothers split up, show that Abraham was angry about how the inheritance was split up. He accused Abram of using the situation to get the best part of the land. Abram defended himself carefully, saying that he had tried to be fair and that the division had been made according to his father's wishes. The tone of the letters was cold, formal, and full of resentment that was hard to hide. But later letters, especially those from 1912 and 1913, showed a huge change. Abraham wrote about how his money problems were getting worse, how his investments were going wrong, and how dangerous people were starting to make threats. He asked Abram for help, but not money. He wanted something more important. He wanted a chance to start over and get away from the bad things that had happened because of his bad choices. Abram, surprisingly, seemed open to it. He answered carefully but with compassion, saying that they were still brothers and still had a bond that could never be broken. The plan to switch identities started to take shape in these letters. At first, Abraham thought the idea was too good to be true, an impossible way to solve his problems. But Abram didn't say no right away. Instead, he started to really think about it and asked practical questions like how it could work, what the risks would be, and what each person would need from the other. The letters showed that they had been planning for months, talking about every detail and trying to think of every possible problem. It was clear from these letters that both brothers were sick of their lives. Abraham was in a hurry to get away from the consequences, But Abram also seemed to feel a weight and boredom in his lonely life in the mountains. He probably never told his neighbors in Spruce Pine how much he liked the idea of starting over in the West and trying something new and different. The goal of the plan wasn't just to save Abraham. It was also to give Abram the chance to change that he secretly wanted. But the last letter in the collection, written by Abraham and apparently never sent, dated August 1913, showed that things were falling apart. Abraham wrote that Abram was having second thoughts about the whole plan and thought they should just help each other in more normal ways. Abraham was angry and scared because he thought he was losing his only chance to get away. He wrote about how far he had come and how much he had put at risk to get to Spruce Pine, and now his brother was backing out at the last minute. They never finished the letter. It stopped in the middle of a sentence, as if Abraham had been interrupted or had decided it wasn't worth it to keep writing. Marsh held on to that letter for a long time, trying to read between the lines of the hurried writing to figure out what had really happened in the last few days before the person went missing. This letter that was never sent showed a lot more stress than Abraham had said in his last confession. It made me think that the argument last night might have been much worse, with a lot more anger and despair than he had said. Marsh told his deputies about these results, but he didn't want to make them public. There was already a lot of talk and guessing going on in the community. Adding to it would only make things worse. Instead, he carefully saved all the papers, evidence, and letters, making a complete record of the case for future generations, in case new information comes to light. In the fall of 1915, the bright colors that always turned the Appalachians into a work of art came. It had been 2 years since the first disappearance, and the people of Spruce Pine were slowly starting to move on. People in the area told the story of Abram Hargrove on cold nights. It was a mystery that would probably never be fully solved. Some people believed what Abraham wrote in his letter. Some people still thought that something bad had happened, and some people came up with their own complicated theories that included conspiracies, fake identities, and destinies that ranged from redemption to tragedy. A lot changed in the Appalachian Mountains area of North Carolina in the years that followed. People were more interested in World War I than in local problems like Abram Hargrove's disappearance. These problems slowly faded from people's minds and became more like legends than real investigations. Sheriff Marsh stayed in his job until 1918, when he retired and handed the case over to a younger person. However, he never fully gave up on it. He kept a personal notebook during his retirement years where he wrote down any new information about the Hargrove brothers, no matter how small it seemed. In 1920, something unexpected happened that brought the case back into the news. A man in his 80s showed up in Spruce Pine and said he was a distant cousin of the Hargrove family. He had come from Virginia because of problems with family inheritance that were only now being worked out after the death of a shared aunt. While he was in town, he told stories about the family that gave us a new perspective on how the twin brothers got along. Nathaniel Hargrove, this cousin, said that the fight between Abraham and Abram went much deeper than just disagreements over property. Nathaniel said that the twins were born into a family that really cared about the firstborn, even if it was only a few minutes apart. Abram was born first by such a small margin that it shouldn't have mattered, but it did to their father. This one small thing about their birth set different expectations, treatment, and chances for them throughout their childhood and teenage years. Abram was ready to take over the family farm and run it, but Abraham was told to look for other ways to make money. This situation had hurt Abraham very deeply. He always felt like he was second best, because people always compared him to his brother, who was born just a few minutes before him. Nathaniel talked about how Abraham was often forgotten or ignored at family gatherings, and how his successes were downplayed while Abram's were celebrated. It wasn't done on purpose, but it was a cultural expression of old beliefs about primogeniture and family continuity. But over the years, the cumulative effect had been terrible for Abraham's sense of self-worth. All of these problems came to a head when their father died and they had to split up the property. Abraham didn't just want his fair share of the money, he also wanted to be recognized, validated, and told that he was just as valuable as his twin brother. But that never happened. Abram, who had the same cultural expectations as Abraham, couldn't even understand why he was so angry. He thought that things had been done right, in line with tradition and the way things should be. At that time, it was impossible for them to truly reconcile because they couldn't understand each other's points of view. Nathaniel also told them something that no one in Spruce Pine knew. There was a third brother, older than the twins, who died as a baby before Abraham and Abram turned 10. This older brother should have gotten everything, but when he died too soon, Abram had to fill the gap because he was the first of the twins to be born. This new information made the family history even more complicated. It seemed to show that both Abraham and Abram were, in a way, victims of things that neither of them had done. Marsh, who was already old but still sharp, looked for Nathaniel to talk to him for a long time about the family. He showed his cousin the letters that were found under the cabin's floorboards. This let Nathaniel read the letters that the brothers sent back and forth in the years before they went missing. Nathaniel was clearly moved as he read those words. For the first time, he saw proof that the brothers had tried to get back together despite everything. He said that the family had always thought they had broken up in anger and that they hadn't spoken to each other since 1895. But it was Nathaniel's offhand remark that changed the way people looked at the case. He said that Abraham had always had trouble with alcohol when he was stressed, and that it got worse when he felt trapped or hopeless. No one had ever said anything about this before, but it made a lot of sense of the strange behavior that witnesses had talked about. If Abraham was drinking a lot in the last few days at Spruce Pine, it could explain why he made rash choices, why the disappearance was staged in such a disorganized way, and maybe even how heated the last argument with Abram was. Nathaniel stayed in Spruce Pine for a few weeks to take care of legal issues related to the family inheritance. He went to the old Hargrove property during that time, which has changed a lot since then. The old cabin had been torn down, and the new owner had built more modern buildings for logging. There was little left to show that someone named Hargrove had ever lived there. Nathaniel stood there for a long time, thinking about what his cousins must have been like in their last days in that clearing, surrounded by mountains that would never change. Nathaniel did something unexpected before he left. He set up a small memorial at the Spruce Pine Church for both brothers, not just Abram. He said that no matter what happened on that last night of September 1913, both Abraham and Abram were victims of forces bigger than themselves. They were stuck in family and cultural patterns that shaped their lives in ways they couldn't fully control. The memorial was simple, but a lot of people came, including many of the same people who had been at public events years before. During the service, Nathaniel read a poem he had written especially for the occasion, reflecting on brothers separated by fate but united by blood, on paths that diverge in the mountains but always lead back to the same roots. There was no judgment in his words, only a deep sadness for the tragedy of wasted potential, of a reconciliation that had come too late or too imperfectly to save either of them from their destinies. In the following years, rumors occasionally surfaced about sightings of men who might be Abram. A 1923 report mentioned a lone farmer in Montana who matched the description and had a distinctive scar on his right hand. Another one, from 1927, talked about a sawmill worker in Northern California who sometimes said he was from Appalachia and seemed to know a lot about North Carolina. But none of these accounts were investigated sufficiently to confirm or deny them. At this point, it seemed pointless to keep looking for ghosts because so much time had passed. Marsh died in 1931, taking with him any hope of a definitive resolution. His personal notebook, containing decades of notes on the case, was preserved by his family and eventually donated to the Mitchell County Historical Archives. Over the years, a few researchers have looked at these records and come to slightly different conclusions about what really happened on that remote property in September 1913. Some historians argue that Abraham's letter was essentially true, that Abram really did escape west and lived out the rest of his days under a different name, perhaps even achieving the peace and prosperity he sought. This interpretation sees the story as a tale of second chances, of brothers who finally managed to overcome old resentments to help each other, even if imperfectly. Other researchers remain skeptical, pointing to inconsistencies in Abraham's letter, vague details about that last night, and disturbing signs found on the property that were never adequately explained. This interpretation sees the story as possibly darker, suggesting that the final argument between the brothers may have escalated beyond their control, that words led to impulsive actions, and that the carefully crafted plan crumbled into consequences neither of them foresaw. And there is a third interpretation, less popular but intriguing. Some suggest that both brothers managed to execute modified versions of their plans, that both Abraham and Abram eventually headed west by different routes, that the contradictory sightings over the years were real, because both were out there, living separate lives under different names, each carrying the memory of that tense last night, but never returning to confront the past directly. Time has a peculiar way of transforming events into legends, and legends into whispers that echo through generations. The Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina have always been guardians of countless narratives, each valley and each peak carrying stories that intertwine with the morning mist and the night wind. The story of the Hargrove siblings became part of this silent collection, a story that slowly fades away into the vastness of time, leaving only memories and questions behind. Decades passed over those lands with the inevitability of the seasons. Wildflowers grew in the fields where a cultivated property used to be in the spring. Summers warmed the stones of the paths that two brothers may have walked side by side at some distant time. Autumns painted the leaves with shades of fire and gold, indifferent to the human dramas that unfolded beneath those same trees. Winters covered everything in snow, which temporarily erased every mark, trace, and physical memory of what happened there. The little town of Spruce Pine went on living quietly, welcoming new generations who built their own stories on top of the old ones. Kids who heard about the strange brothers when they were young grew up and forgot most of the details. These adults got older and told even less accurate versions of the story to their children, who then told it to their children, and so on, until the story became just another piece of local mythology, like all the other stories that mountain communities remember. The way we deal with mysteries that haven't been solved is very human. We find them interesting because they reflect the uncertainty in our own lives. How often do we make choices that we don't fully understand the effects of? How often do our interactions with other people leave us with questions we can't answer, conversations we can't finish, and options we haven't thought about? We can all relate to the story of the Hargrove siblings because we've all felt the pull of different paths, the push of choices that take us to places we've never been before, and the way relationships change in ways we never expected. There are special things about the relationships between siblings. We don't pick our siblings like we pick friends or partners. They are just there, sharing our history from the start and watching us grow and change without knowing it. Being forced to be close to each other can make both the strongest bonds and the most tense situations. We know each other too well. We know exactly where the weaknesses are, where to push, and where to give comfort. And when something goes wrong in these relationships, the damage can last for decades and seem impossible to fix. The story makes us think about identity in interesting ways. Who are we, really? Do our names, our roles in the family, and what other people expect of us define us? Or is there something more important and basic that stays with us no matter what happens outside? Would we still be ourselves if we could switch lives with someone else, even a sibling? Or would we find out that we can't be separated from our experiences, the choices we've made, and the paths we've taken? There is also the idea of starting over, which is a fantasy that almost everyone has, of being able to erase the past and start over. How many of us have thought about just leaving when we're angry or sad and going somewhere where no one knows us, where we can be whoever we want to be, free from all the expectations and judgments we've built up? This idea of being able to change completely is very appealing. But the truth is that we take our past with us wherever we go, as many people find out. Our insecurities, how we act, and how we think all stay the same, and they shape our new situations as much as they shaped the old ones. The mountains will always be there, silently watching as generations come and go. Those old mountains have seen civilizations come and go, forests grow and be cut down and grow back, rivers change their paths, and trails become roads and then be reclaimed by nature. In the grand scheme of things, all of human history is just a short breath. But for those of us who live these short lives, every moment feels huge, and every choice feels important. We have to think about our own family relationships when we think about the siblings in this story. How many talks do we put off because we think there will always be time? How many times do we let misunderstandings turn into anger because it's easier than actually talking to each other? How many bridges do we burn because we're proud or scared, only to find out years later that we wish we could cross them again? The story's lack of clarity may be its best feature. We don't know for sure what happened in those last few days. We don't know everything, every little thing, or the whole truth. And this gives us space to think, to imagine, and to put our own experiences and ideas into the story. Everyone who hears this story can see parts of their own lives and relationships in it in a different way. The way stories change over time is beautiful. What starts as specific events slowly becomes something broader and more meaningful. The specific details fade away like stones in a river, leaving only the basic shapes and themes that are important to people of all ages and cultures. The story of the Hargrove brothers turned into a story about all the complicated family ties, all the attempts to escape and change, and all the hard choices we have to make when we're stuck. Mountain communities keep their stories alive in a unique way, not by keeping detailed records or official documents, but by passing them down orally. Tales told around the fire, whispers passed down through the years. As the stories are passed down, they take on a life of their own, changing slightly with each telling to fit the values and concerns of the new generation that hears them. The original story could completely go away and be replaced by something that looks the same but has completely different content. And maybe that's right. Maybe stories shouldn't be set in stone. Maybe they should be living things that change and grow to meet the needs of the people who tell and hear them. A story that is powerful and relevant in one time period may need to be told differently in another to stay that way. The emotional core stays the same, but the details can change to fit the way people live their lives. When we go to places where old stories happened, we don't usually find any physical proof of those events. Nature takes back what is hers. With quiet efficiency, structures fall apart, trails are reclaimed, and signs of human activity are erased. But there is still something there, an atmosphere, a feeling that this place means more than just the physical. Maybe it's just our imagination, the way we like to make up stories about the things around us. Or maybe places really do absorb some of the lives that were lived there, keeping echoes that only those who are sensitive enough can hear. History makes us think about what truth really is. There are many ways in which we can never really know what happened between these two people. Even if we had seen the events happen, we would still see them through the lens of our own points of view, knowledge, and biases. It may always be impossible to find the objective and complete truth when it comes to complicated human interactions. We only have bits, interpretations, and options, and maybe that's all there is to it. Maybe looking for understanding is more important than finding a clear answer. The mountains will still be there long after we are gone. They will see new stories, new dramas, and new people trying to find meaning and connection in a world that doesn't care. And maybe some of these new stories will become part of the local stories along with the story of the Hargrove siblings. Each will add its own voice to the chorus of human experience that these old lands hold. Ultimately, this story doesn't give us any clear answers or facts. We leave with questions, thoughts, a new understanding of how complicated human relationships are, and how fragile our certainties are. We remember that our choices matter, that our words have power, and that the connections we have with others are important and should be cared for. We learn to appreciate the unknown, the mysterious, and the fact that not everything in life can or should be fully understood. As the sun sets behind the peaks, the shadows keep dancing across the valleys. The wind still whispers through the trees, bringing with it bits of all the stories these mountains have seen. And if we listen closely enough, we might be able to hear echoes of two brothers in that whisper. We might hear their hopes and fears, their struggles to get through impossible situations, and their search for redemption or a new start. The story is not a record of facts, but a meditation on timeless themes. Family and alienation, identity and change, choice and consequence, and the human search for meaning in a universe that doesn't always give clear answers. And how in the end, we are all just people trying to get through lives that are both our only possessions and completely out of our control. If you enjoyed this trip through the past, you might want to subscribe to the channel. There are always more stories to tell, mysteries to solve, and thoughts to share about what it means to be human. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Think about the themes we talked about and share your own thoughts. Remember that every story we hear and every narrative that moves us becomes part of our own journey, shaping how we see the world and our place in it.